Hello, everybody, and welcome back to 21st Century Vitalism. If you're new to the show, this is a podcast exploring how we can best maintain a sense of energy, inspiration, and wakefulness while dealing with the unique stressors of this very strange and potent time. My name is Brett. I'm going to be your host on this journey. For those of you rejoining us, I want to say thank you for your patience as we are coming back from a brief hiatus. I had some personal, professional, developmental things that I needed to attend to this spring, but I am back with a whole new host of conversations waiting your eardrums. I am so excited to start unveiling some of these episodes to you that I have. They're really, really dang good. And because they're so good, I wanted to also take a moment to kind of update some of the things. So you might notice the visuals are a little bit different, as well as the intro song. So I worked with Michael Rempel, who is one of the co-founders of the band Lotus, on creating that amazing piece. I mean, it was all him. And it was just so seamless and wonderful, and I'm just so happy with how that turned out. So I really want to start by saying just thank you so much to Michael for his enthusiasm and his hard work on such an amazing piece. If you want anything for your show or whatever project you're working on, I'm going to have the links to his stuff down below. He's really a treat to work with. So yeah, like I said, we have quite a few episodes waiting to be released right now, and we're going to kick off this new chapter of the show with an actual really incredible human being that I have just found such an incredible honor in hosting for this platform. Her name is the Venerable Robina Courtin. She is a Buddhist nun, ordained for over 45 years. She has a very long and storied life of service and engagement with these practices and community outreach, namely with her project, the Liberation Prison Project, which she has gone to found, which has served over 20,000 inmates in helping bringing Buddhist practice and mindfulness practice to folks who are oftentimes forgotten by society. It's such an important and amazing work. She has done a lot of things. I really encourage you to check out the documentary that was filmed about her life. It's called Chasing Buddha. It's free on YouTube. It really is an incredible story that she has lived. She's done so much for the community and her lineage, and she's really a force of nature for the folks who are plugged into this world of Buddhism. You probably already know her for her fierce and clear and compassionate explorations of Buddhism. So this was a huge honor and treat for me to be able to host her on here. For today's episode, we're going to be talking about this idea that she has of becoming your own therapist, and this very somewhat obvious seeming, but frankly fairly difficult notion of being able to change your mind. This is such a good conversation. I've listened to it multiple times at this point and still find something new every time. So if this is something that clicks for you, I encourage you to check out her platform, robinacourtin.com. Link will be down below. Also check her out on social media. She's on Facebook, Instagram, maybe TikTok. I think that too. I'm not on there. I wouldn't know. But she has really amazing bite-sized, pithy teachings that she releases every couple of days. Really just good hits of Dharma to get you through the day and contemplate. And she has just such a great speaking style, and I just am absolutely in love with everything that she's doing right now. So that's what we have going on. If you want to stay in contact with this show, please consider subscribing over on YouTube. Hit the bell, do all that stuff. You're a part of the digital age. You know how it works. Instagram, Facebook. I'm not on TikTok. I have refused thus far. We'll see how that goes. I think that's it for the general housekeeping stuff. Really, welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm so excited for this next batch of conversations. I've been sitting on them for a moment, and I am just so excited with where the show is going. So thank you so much. Whatever you need to do, whether it's kicking back, drinking some tea, just please open your heart for today's guest, Venerable Robina Courtin. All right, Venerable Robina, hello and welcome. Thank you so
Thank you
much
so much.
for
Happy to be
joining me.
here. Sorry, I
Yeah.
interrupted. Maybe you should start again. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, it's okay. It's okay. Thank you for joining me with the show here. It's an honor to have
Okay.
you on.
Thank you.
I've been plugged into your platform for the better part of a year now, and
Mm,
I've found it to be incredibly insightful.
good.
So thank you for
I'm
all your
delighted.
work.
I'm happy. Thank you. Good, good, good.
Yeah. So, for the folks who are not familiar with you, you've been a
Hmm.
lifelong practitioner of Buddhism. You have taught thousands of people at this point, including
Hmm.
some folks who are in some pretty dire circumstances, serving life sentences in prisons across the
Hmm.
world.
Hmm.
And as I come to understand based on my time with your content, one of the most perennial messages that I've recognized is this notion that we can actually change our minds. And it's something that sounds so plain and so simple, but I think when people hear that, they might feel a pang of excitement and also maybe like overwhelmed. It's like, how is that even possible?
Yes, that's it. That's it.
How do we get started
I
with
know.
this
I think
process?
that's a really good point, and it does sound so simple. It's almost embarrassing. It's like a joke, you know. Change your mind. What are you talking about? Of course, I can change my mind, but it's very clear. Everything I think is stacked against us changing our minds, and I think even that means this is not being rude, but I think our philosophical views, our scientific views, they all seem to buy into the idea that this is the way to put it, the outside world is the main influence in our lives, you know. But the Buddha's approach is so absurdly different. It's like, no, no, no. It's pretty powerful. You can't deny. But the mind is the one that's the most powerful, and that's pretty encouraging. And that's why, I mean, I found working with people in prison where they don't have the luxury to change the outside, where you either then would go mad or you change your mind, you know. So that for me is such a power. There's such good examples of the efficacy of this approach, you know. But so I think the starting point is to actually consider, to think about the logic of it and see, well, maybe that sounds like a possibility. That it's
Yeah.
that my so what it means by changing your mind, and we can go into this, up to you, is by changing the way you interpret something. And that's a surprise, because when you think, you know, like if you're angry, um and you think you can change your anger, but what do you mean? What do you mean change your attitude? Because the Buddhist approach is we have these very intense emotional states, and we all know them: jealousy, depression, anxiety, anger, low self-esteem. We know they're painful, but to hear that they're actually attitudes, to hear that they're really emotional expressions of a conceptual thoughts, of interpretations of something, that's the part that takes time. But we can go into that, we can discuss it, you know,
Yeah.
if you
Yeah,
wish.
I think a lot of the general consensus, and maybe this is just me being just transparent about how I feel about it. Oftentimes, when we are met with an experience that seems really overwhelming, there's kind of an instantaneous nature to, say, anger. It arises
Mhm.
so quickly. So the idea for folks who have really severe outbursts, the idea like, wait, you're telling me that I can respond differently? It can be
Mm.
really hard to, the experience of something so fiery
Yes.
and intense. How do we begin to kind of chip away at that habitual thing that's been with us our entire lives?
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And I can really speak from experience. I mean, I really felt in my life that anger was like my middle name, you know. So I think there's various reasons it's hard to hear. So the very first one, I'd say, well, there are many, and this is all sort of, I think we can verify it with our own experience, but this is coming straight from the Buddhist analysis, but putting it in very down to earth words, you know. I think that it seems deeply ingrained in us that when something bad does happen, and bad things do happen, people do terrible things to each other on this planet. We can't argue with that. You know, look at the world every day. So there's no doubt that terrible things happen. So then, if we have a tendency to be angry, and that's not everybody's tendency, then it's we really believe, what do, what do you mean, change my mind? I am right. Look what that person did to me. I'm allowed to be angry. So we have this very inbuilt belief that it's justified, whatever response we have. And in one sense, you can say, of course, I'm allowed to be angry. If you punch me in the nose, of course, I'm allowed to be angry. But this analysis here is simply, what we need to learn to look at is is the suffering that anger causes. And that is a tremendous thing that's so difficult, because what I believe utterly is that it's not my anger that causes me suffering, it's your punch in the nose that causes me suffering. And that's the part that's really hard to hear, you know. Always example I give, a really good example, a very powerful example of actually a friend in prison. Her name is Sunny, and I think she wrote a memoir. This is back in the 70s. Just this nice Jewish girl with a hippie husband and hippie kids hitching in Florida, and they get picked up by two guys. I don't know the whole story, I can't remember, but she's a friend of mine now. She's out of prison. She's old now. She's living in Ireland. She got out after 17 years. But she was, they were picked up, and then somehow the two guys driving the car got stopped by the police, and the two guys killed the police and blamed the hippies. So they were on death row in Florida. The husband eventually got executed. His head burst into flames. I mean, like nightmarish story, one after the other. You can't imagine it, you know. She was in solitary confinement for years. I mean, it's like medieval, the kind of intense treatment. So they were both totally and utterly innocent. She eventually was found to be innocent, and she got out after 17 years. But she's this amazing example of a person. And what's so interesting, she's not a Buddhist, she's not religious in any way. So the only way I can put it is she somehow was able to find this kind of she had this emotional intelligence. And for me, it's the only way to say it. That she's not a Buddhist. She never heard of Buddhism. She didn't think about Buddhism. But this is exactly the point the Buddha's making, that it is possible, no matter how bad the situation is, you can learn to see it differently, refer to it, respond to it differently, not just blindly with the unhappy emotions. So what she was able to do, she was in her cell on her own, isolated. You know, you can't believe it initially. You can't believe that these people aren't going to believe that you didn't do this thing, right? So eventually I finally realized I could not change anything, but they couldn't take my mind from me. So she said, I decided, different things she said, and we've discussed it since, but she said, I decided I am not a prisoner. I am a monk. I am not in a cell. I'm in a cave. Now, that can sound very romantic, like she's living in La La Land. But, I mean, there's far more to it than that. But basically, she said she knew she had the choice not to go crazy. She had the choice not to go out of her brain with anger. She had the choice to change the way she interpreted. So, I mean, it sounds so simple, but it's absolutely outrageous. And so the whole point of it is this. It's not moralistic. Oh, you're naughty, you shouldn't be angry. It's not the point. The point is, if we start to look into our minds, we're going to see the pain of anger, depression, jealousy, anxiety, and they're all got the same character of being deeply disturbing to oneself. And that brings two consequences. One is you completely lose your mind. You have no common sense left, especially with anger. You've completely lost the plot. You've gone off the planet. You have no control. You can't control anything you think or do or say, and you can literally go mad, which is not uncommon. So I remember at the same time of reading about Sunny, this other fellow on death row, also innocent, and this is not uncommon, unfortunately, who'd been accused of rape and murder. He'd be what we call normal, that he completely did go crazy. He went out of his brain every day. As long as he had a voice, he would be screaming, I did not rape and kill that woman. I did not rape and kill that woman. Now, we would say that's normal. That's reasonable. Of course he acts this way. Look what they've done to him. All of those points are true. Look what they've done to him. But the thing is that's so hard to see. If you'd gone to him then out of kindness and said, well, you know, sweetheart, there are ways you can learn to be less angry and less out of your brain so you don't lose your sanity, so that you can become more relaxed. And even then, if you want to do something about getting out of prison, which is what happened to Sunny, because she didn't lose the plot, she continued to never give up working on her freedom, and she eventually got freedom. But when you've lost your mind, when you're out of your brain with despair, grief, loss, depression, you name it, you can't lift a finger for yourself or anyone else. And this is how we know it's true. But if we're fixated on, but the person, look what they did to me, I'm allowed to be angry. It's just, you're right, but what good is it? And it's hard to get to this. It's hard to navigate to get to this because it sounds so heavy, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, it
You
seems like
understand?
It seems like the deciding factor that differentiated those experiences was that prerequisite of the emotional intelligence that you alluded
I'd say
to.
that's right. I agree totally. She was a miracle. She was amazing. It's most unusual to find a person. I mean, even all the, this is Buddhist teachings. I could say it's Buddhist teachings. He didn't invent this. He just is an expert at it. That's all. And she didn't know any of that. She just had this inbuilt in her, this ability to see that she knew she didn't have to go mad, and she had the power to do it herself. That's pretty incredible, actually,
It is. So
isn't
for
it?
the people who might not have such a awareness of
Mm,
that direct connection to
that's
the
right.
emotional
Mm,
intelligence,
yeah.
can they develop that, or is that something that's just kind of hereditary, or how do
No, no,
they
no. I think it's
cultivate
not.
that?
Yeah, that's the point. We all got the power to. So I suppose the first point is you have to know, you have to be. I mean, the Buddha's point is, it's not punitive. We hear it as very punitive. Oh, you shouldn't be angry. You shouldn't be jealous. You're naughty. We hear it as very punitive, but that's not the point. It's really a person. I mean, the Buddha in this case, his approach is, look, sweethearts, look, dear ones, do you not see how much pain it causes you? He's trying to get us to see that the anger and the depression and the anxiety and the despair are actually the main source of the pain, not the external person or event. So it's to learn to try and see the truth of that. And that takes courage itself, because there's a powerful kind of righteousness to anger, especially. I know for myself. So you have to just know it's possible and have a genuine, and really it's I mean, the way they say it in Buddhism, you have to recognize that it causes you suffering, and you're sick of suffering. So it's like, you're only when you finally realize your attachment to alcohol is what's destroying you. Yes, the alcohol's pretty powerful, but you've got the power to change. It's the same principle. You have to first be exhausted by the suffering of it, and then see, it sounds reasonable, let's see if I've got the courage to do it. And it's a lifelong practice. I mean, anger's been my common response to things, and I used to pride myself. And the other point that I think is powerful, okay, there's so many things we can talk about here, but I think one of the crucial things is to be able to distinguish between finding fault and being angry with it. I remember Martin Luther King. I was an old radical lefty political activist before I was a Buddhist, right? And I remember being very involved in the 60s and 70s. I remember Martin Luther King, he said, it's good to find fault. It's good to see the injustice, the suffering, the racism, the poverty, which means, but then he said, but then you say, what can I do to help? Which is compassion, not anger. So anger would be on top of that. It's the fact that there's poverty. It's the fact that you punch me in the nose. It's the fact that you're on death row and you're innocent. They're facts. That's not anger. They're facts. So then it's to distinguish between the simple fact that is wrong, and then see what you can do about it, and that demands sanity and clarity. But we assume, because a bad thing happened, well, of course I'm angry. What do you expect? If we don't realize they're two separate things, that's quite a revelation, I think. Or even like you get a pain in your knee. Of course I'm angry. I've got a pain in my knee. No, a pain in the knee is fact. Let's see how I can interpret it. Let's see how I can observe it and do something about it. So it's really very clear, that point. So our trouble is, we think when you say don't get angry, we think it's chucking the baby out with the bathwater and becoming passive. Not at all. It's not like that at all. It's a big, big difference.
Yeah, when I started practicing Buddhism about 3 years ago, I'm fairly
Mm-hmm.
fresh at it, but one of the really turning teachings for me was from Pema Chodron, and it was about our wisdom being intertwined with our neuroses, as she called them, and
Uh-huh.
referencing that all the things that actually cause us hang-ups contain within them the inherent wisdoms and kind of gems of our expression, and that idea that anger is clarity.
That's
Is
a very,
that
it's a very, no, that's a very good point. That's actually, speaking philosophically, that's taken from the highest, the esoteric teachings in Buddhism, from the Vajrayana. I mean, the very first level of practice in Buddhism is just be controlled, be disciplined, not even control your anger yet, but control the servants of your anger and your attachment and your jealousy, and control your body and speech. Harness the energy of your body and speech, because that's what does the harm to others. Then with practice, you can start now to look into your mind and see the pain of anger, the pain of depression, the pain of anxiety and jealousy. Then you can get to the point of developing compassion, the bodhisattva path. Then you can get to the point of seeing what she's pointing out, which is something very powerful. So I can see that with my own mind. if you look at a person who's, angry, I've learned to distinguish the positive qualities, which is what you're saying. Because when a person's angry, they're finding fault. They've got an ability to distinguish, look at that and look at that and look at that, and that's terrible. That's a fact. There is injustice, there is poverty. But then if you take the emotional component, and this is the point about it, and give up the self-centered component, the self-righteous component, which is the angry childish, which is the angry component, keep that wisdom, keep that sharpness, and then learn to want to change things without going crazy. Equally, you can see, you flip that over, you see the good quality of patience is incredible. You don't lose the plot, but there's a negative side to, you could argue, for patient people, you become passive. So we need to not be passive, but to be active, but not angry, but patient. So it's a very interesting mixture, but it's really true what you're saying. And that means that only comes when you start to really see your own mind very well. So you don't chuck the baby out with the bathwater and become sort of some passive, pathetic person thinking you've given up anger. And it's easy to mistake it like that.
Yeah. So for the people who hear this, it's very clear. It seems very easy to understand on an intellectual level. But I feel like embodying that kind of teaching, what is the path of turning the words that you're saying into an actual internal ability to yogically surf that?
It just takes time, really, really takes time, Brett. So I think, the classic Buddhist approach, and depending on even the system you're using in Buddhism, because it's taught in many different ways in many different countries, the classic way of putting it, in a sense, as I said before, this is one approach. When you start to realize, taking the Buddhist, you read a bit of book. Okay, the first step is you read a bit. You read it. You listen to some teachings. You see, well, that sounds interesting. I'd like to look into that. And then you start to read a few things and think about it. So the classic approach, as I just said very briefly before, would be, given that say you read a bit about the Buddha's view, and he's telling us that what goes on in our mind is the main source of our happiness and suffering. And then you start to try and think, well, I'd like to see that. So then you start to realize that your suffering is the main. So you're looking at your suffering and you want to start lessening the suffering. And you've got to be realizing you're sick of suffering. It's not some moralistic idea, I should be a nice girl. You've got to want to be sick of suffering and know that what goes on in here does play a role. That's the first step. So then the very first step, and this sounds so boring in a way, like I said before, the classic presentation of the Buddha's teachings is the first job is you control the servants of your anger, the servants of your attachment, the servants of your jealousy. You can, and especially for us, maybe we don't go around killing and raping too many people, but look at our speech. This sounds so boring in a way, but it's quite profound. If you make a decision to control your speech, don't say those words, 90% of your problems in your relationships in your daily life will be solved. Then they often say in Buddhism, when you're with others, control your behavior. When you're on your own, then you can control your mind. So because behavior is so automatic, because the mind, my anger in my life when I was a kid, I never thought for 1 millisecond I'm going to be angry. I just exploded the second. I didn't get what I wanted, if you like. So controlling the body and speech is a very profound way to start. Then you can learn to meditate, or you can start to meditate, learn little meditation techniques that enable you, this is a mindfulness techniques really, that enable you to step back and become aware of what the hell is going on in this crazy head of ours. And that's a bit scary. They even say in the texts, there's this description of the meditation technique that was invented by these Indians, actually, well before the Buddha. I remember the Dalai Lama said it was these amazing Indians more than 3,000 years ago who were the ones who began the investigation into the nature of self. We arrogant Western people probably think it was Freud 100 years ago, which is ridiculous. So, and we're discovering the wisdom of these amazing Indians now. This is before the Buddha. This technique that's known as shamatha in Sanskrit, or concentration meditation, which is the basis of what the world knows roughly as mindfulness. It's this brilliant technique that enables you to start to concentrate, to focus your mind instead of following every crazy thought. We're not going to get it overnight, but we can start. And so they say in the texts, when they describe this process, one of the signs of success in the very beginning is that you think you're getting worse. You think your mind's getting more crazy. No, we're noticing it. And that's part of the difficulty, because one of the mistaken views of meditation, which is rather naive, is you're learning to meditate so you can get rid of your thoughts. Well, that's absurd. They're deeply ingrained. So one of the results of simply learning to do 5 minutes a day of mindfulness is the technique you're doing is deciding to watch the breath, let's say. That's your job, but you can't help but hear all the thoughts. You just learn to not follow them, and that's pretty powerful. And then you bring to bear, after that, into your daily life, in the kitchen, on the freeway, this ability to notice your thoughts. And that's a brand new thing for us. It sounds surprising, but it's really true. I mean, Lama Zopa, one of my teachers, he says, and it sounds pretty shocking, that the vast majority of people on this planet have no idea, this sounds shocking, have no idea that what goes on in their mind plays any role at all in their lives. And what that means is we're just addicted to the outside world. I mean, we can be forgiven for that. You know, you wake up in the morning until you go to sleep. What are you paying attention to? The world, people, things. You know, it's all the outside world. We rarely give a moment to notice our own mind, and this is the miracle. So learn to control your mouth if you can, if you have to, before you vomit out the words. Learn, you know, that'll solve a lot of the problems. That demands discipline. Then get your practice going and start to observe using meditation techniques like the breath, and then slowly in your daily life, you then become aware of all the thoughts that are going on before they vomit out the mouth, before you want to kill your husband or, you know, kill your kid. It's a slow, gradual process, you know. It's a gradual, and it's very organic. But to know it's possible is what gives us courage to persevere, you know.
Yeah, it's a very courageous path. I mean, I've heard it compared to that of warriorship, just the simple act of taking your seat, as my teacher has said it to me, and just opening up to the flow of your own internal dialogue. There's a lot of very tricky energies that can come up. And it's funny that you mentioned that a lot of people assume it to be this blissful trance-like state where you're just totally pieced out. It's actually a very aggravating kind of space. You deal with boredom, you deal with all of your neurotic qualities that you go through your day trying to ignore and subdue, but are actually controlling so much of how you respond to the world. So, I mean, acknowledging just the nature of that painful quality sometimes of sitting and the courage it takes. You know, I imagine some people who have very troubled backstories, who are really repressing a lot of these things, it probably comes up as they're sitting on the cushion. Do you have any advice for people who may have trauma, that like really severe embodied trauma? Like, how would they be able to engage with mindfulness without getting re-traumatized? And
well, you know, maybe mindfulness is not the right approach, and there's all sorts of ways. It's not the only type of approach. I mean, every word that I'm saying is implying mindfulness simply insofar as it's becoming aware of what the hell is happening in your mind. But I mean, well, for example, myself, you know, my nature is kind of volatile, you can see, and busy and speedy. So I know when I first heard the Buddhist teachings when I was 30, 31 or something, quite a few years ago, I knew immediately it's the path that I'd wanted. My life had led to this, you know. But I knew I had not the slightest interest in sitting on my bottom meditating. I had no interest, but I did want to know my mind. So I just didn't equate meditating with knowing my mind. You can learn to know your mind in a very proactive way. You can learn to be hearing what you're thinking and what's going on, and deal with it. I mean, look at people who go to therapy. You're dealing with your mind in the most intensive way. Your eyes aren't closed. It's not the only method. It's kind of rather naive to think it is. In the long term, we need to be on the cushion to get the mind to the subtler levels that it can access, but 99% of us won't get there. So we have to know the kind of person we are, you know. So proactive ways of learning to be aware of what's going on. We might need support if you've got the type of mind where you've suppressed all your dramas, and that's all trauma is. Trauma, I think, not that's all, but trauma is a word we use to refer to when bad things have happened since we're born, since we're little, and we haven't been equipped to handle them. It's very simple. If you've got a fairly peaceful nature and your father starts whacking you, you're not going to respond with anger. You're going to suppress with enormous fear, and you will push it right out of your memory. You understand? So I can see, like in my life, one advantage of me not being that kind of peaceful person was I didn't suppress. I would shout and yell at my father. I would fight with my father. So I didn't suppress. So one good aspect of that is I was engaged in it. So there was not suppression. There was less fear involved, which is kind of ironic, you know. I still have to learn to. So do you see what I'm saying? So it depends on the person. So if we have got so much trauma, I mean, I've met so many people who haven't been able to deal with it, and so have put it away. We maybe need a more safe place rather than just sitting on our own cushion. That's not advisable, perhaps. It's because we haven't been able to deal. It's going to be too much for it all to come up. It's just too much. That's why in the West there are so many good people, good therapists who can help us learn to, who can be a safe place to help us learn to deal with what's going on in ourselves, you know. And the interesting point here, though, Brett, I think the key Buddhist approach to it, and this is the hard part, is the emphasis on the state of mind, not on the event. And our problem is we only remember the event. You see, I think this is a very interesting point. You say, Robina, tell me about your happiness. And I won't tell you about my happiness, which is in my mind. I'll tell you about the event. I'll describe the cake or the boyfriend. Tell me about your suffering, Robina, and I'll describe the wrong cake and the wrong boyfriend. So we're always only remembering the event. And that very much is the Western approach. The Buddhist one is more profound. When you can do it, you get in touch with whatever the name of the state of the mind was. Attachment, anger, jealousy, they're the names of the state of the mind that are triggered by that event. And that's the awareness we have to cultivate. That's the awareness. And then the ownership of those states of mind. Do you understand?
Yeah. So I have a keen interest in trauma science as a manual therapist myself, engaging with people's bodies. And a lot of the new science has come out with the idea that trauma, it settles in the body and it's constantly reconstituting itself. So in that field, it's less about the event because the event is long gone, but it's that the body is stuck recirculating and it's like it's living that event over and over.
Well, let me just, what I find that very fascinating, if you know anything about the Vajrayana, which is the esoteric teachings that are mainly, I think, extant in Tibet, you know, the esoteric teachings, which coming directly from the Ayurvedic system, it's very similar to the Chinese acupuncture system. The way we're constructed, this is very helpful. I find this very helpful. It's this that they're expressing this extremely intimate, inextricable relationship between the physical and the mental. So it's not the neuroscientific model; it's quite different, but it's very interesting. So according to that model, we've got gross consciousness, which is our senses, and that's clearly related to the physical, the eyes, the ears, and the so on. You know, but then we've got what they call subtle consciousness, which is our mental states. They're more subtle. And at the physical level, subtle, they talk about subtle body, that's made up of these 72,000 subtle channels, and then like a subtle nervous system, and coursing through all that subtle nervous system are these different wind energies or prana. Now this is how we used to talk in the West, but they still talk like this in Tibetan Buddhism, in the medical system, in the Tibetan medical system, in the Ayurvedic, in the Chinese system, these subtle wind energies. And those subtle wind energies coursing through all this nervous system, which is our subtle body, are intimately linked to the different states of mind. So it makes total sense if you've got repression and fear and anger, that's going to completely mess up with your wind energies, which is the physical body, but at a subtler level. So there's different approaches. You know, one is to work on the physical, which can then enact the mental to enable it to come to the surface, or one is you work on your mind, and in that way you purify the physical. So both are very valid. So it makes sense. The body and the mind at a subtle level are intimately connected, you know. Everything we think and say affects the physical at the subtler level, which then impacts at the grosser level of sickness and those kinds of things.
That's wonderful.
And one more point. To say one more point, Brett. What's fascinating about the Buddhist psychological model, they say there's nothing we've ever seen or heard or tasted or touched or smelt or thought about that ever goes astray. Everything is stored in our memory. Now look how we don't remember 99% of one day. So we suppress most of our experiences and then we distort them when we do remember them. But they're all stored in our mind and they're able to be accessed using the Buddhist model of the mind, you know. We've got these subtle levels of cognition and we can learn to access. And that's where I think dealing with trauma, if we can learn to have appropriate help and support or do it on our own, it's up to us. It's when you can... Because it seems to me, okay, I'd like to talk just briefly about attachment. As you know, this is the fundamental Buddhist trip. But it's far more subtle than we think. So as you know very well, the Buddha talks about the 3 poisons, which sounds so cute, you know. So basically there's attachment and aversion. And according to the Four Noble Truths, attachment's our main problem and all the other neuroses stem from it. But of course, that's so different in our culture because we don't use the word like this. But attachment is this primordial emotional hunger, this dissatisfaction, this possessiveness, this neediness, this expectation. It's this painful state of mind that has mainly this sense of dissatisfaction. I'm not enough. I don't have enough. So then it manifests as kind of hankering and craving after something. And so all that's driving everything. So this attachment for the Buddha is the default deep in the bones of our being. And it's this one way of describing it in an essential way is that it's this constant hunger, emotional hunger to only get the nice things. It only can cope with the nice things. Attachment is like a junkie that only wants nice sound, nice smell, nice taste, nice feeling. So what is the response when it doesn't get that? That's aversion. And aversion is the bare bones state of mind that's called anger. So anger is the volatile level. Upset, irritated, frustrated, annoyed is a milder level of anger, and we never pay attention to that. And that's 1,000 times a day. And then even more subtle than that, it becomes depression and despair. So we run between this attachment and aversion 1,000 times a day. So naturally, when your father beats you or that mean person does something harmful to you as a little girl or later, the first response is to have aversion to it because attachment didn't get what it wanted. So aversion can then manifest as you shout. If you shout and yell, I'd shout at my father, or somebody would suppress. So depending on the person. So if we can learn to bring up those memories and confront it and look at it, open the door to it, that dissipates the fear, that dissipates the trauma, because it's this intense fear of that thing that we can't stand, you know. And fear is the character. As far as Buddha is concerned, fear is the character of all these painful emotions. That's why when you've realized emptiness and you've cut the root of all the nonsense, you literally have given up fear. So it's a very encouraging view, you know. This is our potential, Buddha says.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I've been contemplating this past week a lot about boredom and its role in meditation. And as my teacher's teacher, who is Chogyam Trungpa, has talked a lot
Yes.
about the differentiations between cool boredom and hot boredom, and settling into this idea like there's an initial irritation that's really kind of a painful thing when you get really bored and you're like, oh, I don't know, I'm uncomfortable. But then it settles
So that
into
means
a
you call it
space.
boredom, do you? But you call it boredom. So what do you mean by boredom? What do
Just
you
the
mean by boredom?
inability, yeah, just the desire to be away from the raw experience of just existing.
But
Like
that's
you need to like
aversion.
entertain.
That's
Right. And that's what I
aversion.
was going to
That's
ask.
aversion. I
Yeah.
mean, if you think of these three poisons, and this is not, it's such a cute kind of model, three poisons, for God's sake, what are you talking about? You know, it sounds so cute. But actually, the more we study the Buddhist model, it goes to profound levels. So basically, the main one is ignorance, which is this misconception of the self, this wrong view of this, a primordially deep misconception of the very nature of ourself. That's the root one, ignorance. Then it gives rise to attachment, this constant emotional hunger to get what that fantasy I wants. Then the millisecond attachment doesn't get what it wants, it turns into aversion. So there can be mild versions of it and then very volatile ones. So to say boredom, and that means indifference, and that's kind of like going to sleep in a way. That's kind of like
Yeah.
dull. But the wanting to get away from that discomfort, that's aversion. That's aversion. That's the milder level of anger. So we have
Yeah.
attachment. If you're all excited and everything's going lovely, you run towards the object. So if you sit and do your meditation and you have a nice feeling, you're all excited and happy. If you don't have a nice feeling, you're all bored. Or you're bored. Yeah, aversion. You want to get away from it. So we run towards something which is attachment, or we run away from it, which is aversion. These are the primordial ones. I'd put it like that. Actually, what do you think?
Yeah. I think that sounds right. So what happens in those circumstances when you actually get what you want?
Well, that's the tricky part, isn't it? I mean, attachment, you see, is so subtle, so total, so utter, so primordial. But the encouraging thing, as we know from Buddhist teachings, is that attachment and anger and all the other neuroses are not intrinsic to us. They're not at the core of our being. So having that courage to know that, we learn to ever more subtly identify or distinguish, if you like, the attachment from the good qualities. So let's say, you drive the car and your attachment is automatically there and only wants it to be lovely. So the sign of success that it's not so much attachment running the show is when if the car jumps in front of you, you don't get so annoyed. That proves you're not so attached. So then you can and then you can still, and so you would be enjoying the drive because you are getting what you want, which is a hassle-free drive, but it's not coming only from attachment. The sign that happy feeling is coming only from attachment is if you freak out when the car jumps in front of you. That's a real sign of success when you can handle the bad thing happening. You can navigate it. That's the sign of success. That's the indication that it's not only attachment running the show. You getting my point?
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think a lot of people who haven't spent a lot of time with these teachings, and to a degree myself,
Of course,
associate
all of us. Right.
they associate attachment and desire. And I think a lot of
Yeah.
people, especially here in the West, have a hard
Mm.
time giving up the desire for certain circumstances in life. Could be kind of a
Yeah.
hard sell. Is there a way to work with desire in a way that doesn't
Mm.
produce attachment? Like if you want to
Of
express in a certain way, like
I
me
know.
in this podcast, I have a desire to have a successful podcast. That's
I
almost like the
understand. Yeah.
fuel to, yeah.
I understand.
Is that
I mean, it is very interesting. Again, this takes us to the different levels of teachings. The very first level, which is known in the world as the Theravada teachings, is the teachings we share with that path. This is the kind of the very basic level of Buddha's teachings where we're cautious, we control our body, control our speech, and on the basis of that, you'd live in vows, you'd have a very simple life. According to that level, you wouldn't have too much cake or sex or drugs or rock and roll. You'd harness your crazy energy, and you would learn to be satisfied. You'd learn to be content. That's the method of giving up attachment. It sounds totally boring, but when you go to the bodhisattva path, and if you like, you can have your cake and eat it too. But you've got to be very wise and skillful. That is, you can then. I mean, okay, it's going to be a while before we've given up attachment. That's when you finally realize emptiness, when you've given up the nonsense, when you've really achieved the highest levels. So we've got to learn to live with it and navigate it as we progress on our path. So the powerful way to do that on the bodhisattva path is you change your motivation. So there you are doing a podcast. You want to be useful to human beings. But of course, Brett, his attachment wants it to be nice. He doesn't want people to hate him, which is normal. We all don't want to be hated. So as long as you know that, so then if you have a pure motivation, I want to do this podcast so I can help benefit sentient beings so they can see their minds, that motivation becomes more powerful. And that's a good motivation. That's not just attachment. If you only do it for, because attachment's the very nature, the attachment's the main voice of ego, basically. So it's mainly attachment. You'll always be disappointed. But if you have a kind of a more altruistic motivation that you plug in alongside the attachment, then it's more the action you do is more profound and can be more beneficial, and that can lessen your attachment, and that'll make you more authentic, more clear, and more courageous, because you're not just doing it to be successful and be applauded. You're doing it because you
right?
want to be a benefit to others, and that grows. That's bodhicitta, basically.
Yeah.
You
Yeah, that
understand?
kind of leads me to, I mean, my perception of the unfolding of the path is you work on yourself and then you naturally will end up opening up to
Yeah,
others. And I think
that's
that's
right.
mirrored in a
Precisely.
lot of religious
Yeah,
traditions. What about
it's
the
true.
nature of taking this work on naturally opens us? Like, how does that
Yes.
unfold?
Well, I think this is, I repeat it all the time. There's this wonderful analogy, and this is particularly, I think, the Mahayana component. You've got, a bird needs two wings, wisdom and compassion. So the wisdom wing is this first stages of practice, the Theravadan level of the practice, where you control your body, your speech, and your mind. You get renunciation. You live a very simple life. You really learn to harness your crazy energy, and that's a profound thing already. So then, on top of that, you add the bodhisattva path, which is the compassion component. So, but even without adding proactively the compassion component, it's fairly obvious that if you take the Buddhist view, that we've got this neurotic sense of an I. Its main voice is attachment, this emotional hunger to get what the I wants. It then gets upset when it doesn't. And then jealousy and pride and arrogance and all the rest come from that. They're the neuroses, okay? And I think that's a great word. Buddha would have liked that term. They're all the unhappy states of mind, the afflictions, the delusions, and Buddha's very specific in identifying them as quite different from the positive states of mind. And our job is to distinguish between these. So as you lessen, so if you recognize that attachment and anger and depression and jealousy are the source of your pain, they're necessarily I-based. They're totally fear-based. They only cause you suffering, and they therefore cause you to harm others. So naturally, your very first level of practice, even lessening attachment, lessening anger, lessening depression and low self-esteem, automatically grows your empathy, makes you a little bit closer to others. So then you can proactively work on the compassion component and become profoundly beneficial to others. So it's natural progress, a very natural progress, even before you get to the compassion wing. There on the bodhisattva path, you then learn to continue to work on your mind. That never ceases. But now it's in reference to how to be of benefit to others. The very first level of practice is how to be of benefit to yourself, and we shouldn't discount that. Then it's to be beneficial to others. It's a very logical process. I mean, as the Dalai Lama says, compassion, which is the point, it's not enough. You've got to have wisdom, which is the first stages of practice. Put yourself together first. How can I help How can I help you with nutrition if I haven't got the wisdom and nutrition myself? How can I help you play the piano if I can't play the piano? But when it comes to helping people in general, we miss that point. So in other words, we
Yeah.
think we can still be neurotic and help people. We can't. We're limited, you know.
Yeah. So I know that compassion often gets paired with the notion of emptiness, even with bodhicitta. It's relative, aspirational, which is
Mm,
doing good work for people. But then there's the ultimate
sure,
element, which is
sure.
emptiness, and I've heard that
That's
it
right.
arises from that. So
That's
I don't know if this is too deep for
mm,
people who have never heard this, but how do those
okay.
things interrelate?
I understand. Well, you know, I think yeah, okay. So if we take the Buddhist analysis that says everybody suffers because we have this deeply instinctive deep in the bones of our being. And of course, as we know from the Buddha's view, we brought with us from countless past lives. You just take that as an interesting point. So we get born already with this deeply instinctive ego grasping, they call it. And the effect of that is a sense of a separate me, bereft, cut off, separate. You know, and the main voices of that ego grasping are attachment, this emotional hunger. And then when it doesn't get what it wants, the response is anger. And then all the other dramas as a result. This is why we suffer. This is why we suffer. So the consequence for oneself is that they cause us to be miserable every day, to be cut off from others, to never be satisfied, to always be upset, to blame everybody else. You're totally miserable. And incidentally, it causes you to harm others. So that's the wisdom. So the wisdom side leads to emptiness. Compassion doesn't lead to emptiness. The wisdom side is what leads to, because as you progress, controlling your body, controlling your speech, controlling your mind, lessen attachment, lessen anger. Like I said before, you naturally are moving towards a sense of less of a neurotic I and more of a sense of connected with others. So then you practice the compassion wing, but you can't have one without the other. You can practice conventional bodhicitta, but you've got to realize, you've got to do the wisdom wing and finally realize emptiness, realize the absence of that fantasy I. It's a very specific type of approach. So the two go together perfectly. You can have compassion only, but you've got to have wisdom. You can only have wisdom and not compassion. It's never enough. You've got to have both. And they're both very specific approaches, you know.
Have you
Understand?
recognized, because you have a history with being like the leftist, like radical
Yeah,
movements, do you
yeah.
recognize in some of those social systems the desire to be compassionate without wisdom? Have you ever seen that in anything you've interacted with, and potentially what that could be?
I think that's yeah, I think that's the limiting part. And I think especially because for myself when I'm quite radical, I remember when like I'm quoting now what I said before about Martin Luther King. I didn't like him. I preferred Malcolm X, who was radical and no nonsense and get out there and demonstrate and kick and yell and scream. I liked that aspect. That was my nature. It's only now I can appreciate Martin Luther King's approach, which is much more humble. You know, I would say more humble than shouting and yelling. I saw there was some virtue in shouting and yelling. So what am I? So I'd say that was the limitation that I found. I was definitely compassionate. I sacrificed my life. I was out there working. I worked full time. I didn't have a main job. I was demonstrating, doing all the political literature, first as black politics, then feminist politics. I was very committed, 100% committed. I was always trying to find the way to make the world a more happy place. But I never referred it to myself. So I was stunted in my ability to help others because my anger was so tremendous, and I felt it was noble to have that anger because I confused the finding fault with the anger. So it's only really since for me the Buddhist approach that I've learned to not give up the wish to help, just lessen the neurotic aspect, hopefully a little bit. That's the idea. So I think that is what limits political activity. It's hugely. And I remember the Dalai Lama saying one time when he was asked by a journalist, the journalist said, well, anger looks like it's very proactive. It looks like it makes you act. He said, I know what you mean. But if you're mainly motivated by anger, you don't last. You give up. But if it's motivated by compassion, you never give up. And when that compassion is active, not weak and pathetic, then it's very powerful, I'd say. So I think, yeah, absolutely. In other words, if you don't work on yourself, how can you be beneficial to others? You're too limited. It's just not possible. And that's the wisdom wing. That I found to
Yeah.
be quite certain.
Yeah, it seems to me that moving through life in a very compassionately focused way, there's a level of communication that ends up happening because people can feel like you have clarity, but you're not attacking them. And I find that communication when
Yeah,
you're actually connecting is a very energizing and invigorating. And I feel
Mm-hmm.
to what you're saying about being able to go the distance requires that sense of
I think so.
giving and taking.
I
You
think
know?
so. And I think here the main thing we need to understand is the compassion that the Buddha talks about is a much more profound level of compassion. I think it's something to talk about. It's very interesting. I think the moment the compassion we tend to have is only for people who are experiencing the major suffering, like the victims and poverty and racism and sexism, and suffering and being abused and tortured. But the Buddha's view is that everybody is suffering because everybody is driven by attachment and anger and jealousy and pride. And of course, if you have the big long-term Buddhist view of karma, we all are going from life to life to life to life, bringing our own stuff with us, our own goodness and our own badness. And we're continually, blaming. I mean, we're continually, I punch you, the next life you punch me, and then and it never ends, in a way. So the Buddhist approach is in this from the wisdom wing point of view. He's trying to show us that we've got to understand that our attachment and fears and jealousy and depression are the main source of our pain and suffering. And it's not getting the people who do it off the hook, not at all. When we really realize I suffer because of that, then it is easy to look at the harmers out there and see that this, as a result of their anger and their rage and their despair and their jealousy, is why they harm others, and that is why they are suffering. So until you know your own suffering, it's not possible to have empathy for others. You just want to blame and point fingers. So until and this, I think we miss this part in the West. We miss this part, I think. So the deeper compassion is that we're all got anger and depression and jealousy and low self-esteem, and these are the source of our pain. And we know in our own lives, Brett, I swear to you, if any of us have done even only one thing in our life to harm another, only one, guess what? You didn't do it out of love and compassion. You did it out of hurt, resentment, jealousy, anger. It's natural. That's when we hurt others. So when we own it ourselves, we become much more humble, more confident, and therefore more empathetic to others. And empathy and compassion are not weak. That's the biggest mistake. You can talk about courageous compassion of the bodhisattvas. They see that we're all harming ourselves. And so that's why I like the Tibetans are a good example. They're very proactive. They're really good political activists, but they don't have anger against the Chinese, which is quite shocking because they've ruined their country, destroyed their country in 60 years, But they have an understanding of karma. That's why I like to tell this particular story, which is always very shocking. In 2003, when I was based in where was I? Never mind, just in California, running Liberation Prison Project. Okay, we're going to edit, right?
Yeah.
We're going to edit. I'm going to blow my nose.
I can. Yeah.
Hang on, I just have to blow my nose. I can't talk. Hang on a second.
Yeah, it's okay.
Thank you. Excuse me, I'm going to blow. You can turn off the volume if you like.
It's all right.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. So I remember 2003, Richard Gere, whom you know as a Buddhist, he invited the Dalai Lama to teach in New York. And so Richard decided, we discussed it, he decided to invite 20 former prisoners, all of whom had done some kind of meditation in prison, to come to this event. And he invited people like me who'd worked with people in prison. It was very moving. It was a very wonderful day. And it was a whole cross-section of Americans, black, white, Puerto Rican, Mexican, male, female. It was very moving. And they met His Holiness, and it was a wonderful day. But he also invited 2 young Tibetan nuns who'd been sexually abused and tortured in prison. So, of course, I mean, if you have the classic philosophical materialist view, and that's the way to put the scientific view that we have in the world, that your mother and father make you, you're only the brain, there's no soul, there's no spirit, there's no non-physical component, which is the scientific view, and that's the prevailing view in the world. If you have that view, then it makes sense that your mother and father made you, and therefore they're the blame. And so if bad things happen, if someone punches you in the nose, there's no logical reason for it. So no wonder. So if you take the Buddhist view, it's a very different view, But you bring your own consciousness with you. It's imprinted with all your actions, negative and positive. It's like we are our own creators. The Dalai Lama calls the law of karma like self-creation, which is basically everything we think and do and say programs our mind, and that mind, which is not physical, will then leave this body and will produce our next future lives. I mean, it's a different view. So these Tibetans, this is a view that's been around for 3,000 years. The Indians were the ones first who came up with this. Then Buddha diverged in his own direction, and that's a fundamental view in Buddhism. So these young Tibetan women, this view has been in their culture for 1,200 years. It's like in their bones. In the same way that the materialist view is in our bones and we take it as a given, they take karma as a given. It's nothing surprising to them, you know. So then, because they've got that view and because they're really working on their minds, putting their money where their mouth is with their practice, there they were talking about their suffering. One was in tears. But what was really clear to the Americans was they weren't angry. And this is a big shock. But if you analyze anger, the conceptual story of anger is, how dare you do that to me? I don't deserve it. So that's huge in our minds. And that's reasonable if you came from your mother and father. It's reasonable. You know, because that person who rapes you or who takes your money or punches you in the nose, you've never met them before. But it's the same with happiness. It's we call it good luck and bad luck, you know. So, for the Tibetan, these young women for whom karma is totally natural, they have an explanation for why bad things are happening. They have an explanation for why good things are happening, and that gives them the ability to be accountable and to own their experiences. So they weren't angry with these torturers and these sexual abusers. And at the end, one of them was very quiet, and she said, and of course, we had compassion for our torturers because we knew we must have harmed them in the past. And because, this is the most powerful point, because we know they will suffer in the future because we create our own selves. This I've always found the karmic view, when you understand it properly, you can understand it badly. You know, there's really wrong views about it. It's a very powerful concept. You know, I found when I first met the Buddha's teachings, the karmic one was one that I thought I'd been missing. I find it very powerful because it demands accountability, like those young women. That they realize they have a view for why the suffering is happening, but also happiness. They know why there's happiness as well because we are the creators. So that's, I find, pretty powerful.
Yeah, I'm not going to pretend to know the full implication of karma because I know it's so deep, but just the little
It
bit
is.
that I have touched
Yes.
in, I feel the sense of settling into my experience a lot deeper and a sense
That's
of
interesting.
curiosity and openness rather
There you
than
go.
that aversion. You know, there's a sense of like,
That's
well,
right.
why is this here? You know, why am I feeling this thing? How long have I been feeling this thing?
Yeah, very good
That's
point. That's a nice way to put it, Bruce. I think the way I like to talk about karma, because I mean, it's just the simplest way to put it for me is that the Buddha would say that these countless consciousnesses, the word they use, mind or conscious, are virtually synonymous. And there are countless sentient beings. And the term in Tibetan is very nice. It's Sem Chen, which means mind possessor. There are countless mind possessors. He does not posit a creator at all. There's very, deep philosophical discussions about this. At this point, he diverged from the Hindus. He doesn't say that our mother and father give us a mind, which is pretty shocking for us because we think they did. They give us a brain, but they don't give us our mental tendencies, our love, our compassion, our kindness, our being good at football or music or anger for that matter. We bring those with us. That's the major point. So the most basic approach to that, then, if you recognize that you came into this world programmed with your own tendencies, good and bad, then it lessens the victim view. It lessens not fair. It lessens how dare I didn't ask to get born. This is the commonest thing we say. We realize we created the cause to be who we are, and we created the cause for all the happy experiences and the suffering ones. It's a pretty big leap, but once we get used to it, it's very empowering because then you start to, Buddha uses the analogy of seeds and fruits. So when you have the view of karma, I find it's like whatever you meet in your life, it's your life is your garden. So if the bad things happen, you planted those seeds. If the good things happen, you planted those seeds. But the tragedy is we tend to only think of karma in terms of the bad things, I joke, but I'm serious when I say no one has ever asked me the question, why do good things happen? We only ask why the bad things happen, We're a bit addicted to misery, I think. But karma is very powerful if we take that view. And those young nuns are a very perfect example of it, the efficacy of the view. And that reminds me also, a friend of mine who works with people in prison, he's an American in North Carolina, Andre. Years ago, his son was murdered in a bar, and he was interviewed on the television that night. And they said, how do you feel about the murder? And he's a Buddhist. And he immediately was in tears of compassion for the murderer, for the boy. He said, how can I not have compassion for him? His suffering is only just beginning. I mean, that's intense, isn't it?
wow.
And it's true. It's true, because if it's your son who is a murderer, you'd only have compassion for him. But we want to have anger. So it was very profound.
Wow. That's touching. Yeah.
Yes.
this idea of karma is also, I feel like it opens up for genuine celebration of your unique embodiment. I think a lot of people, when
Yes,
they
I like
first
that.
tap into
That's right.
this, they
Yeah.
imagine that in order to do these kinds of practices, you have to convert into one neutral mono expression of what spirituality is. But the more you touch
Mm.
into really celebrating your unique disposition, that's something that really touched me about your teaching style, is you do have this energy about you that I find to be very unique amongst a lot of Buddhist teachers. And you really have honed in on that and used that energy in a very skillful way. And I think that that is a transformative um, idea, that you don't really have to get rid of the things in order to actually
No, that's a
take
big,
the
I think a
steps.
cliche. That's right. It's a cliched kind of view that we turn into this kind of passive clone of other passive clones. It's really awful. It's such a superficial understanding. I think that's what I like about. Well, I mean, if you meet Tibetans, you look at Dalai Lama. He's such a good example. He's funny. He's loud. He's very powerful. He's not this cliched view of a nice, peaceful person, which we think is like a little wimpy person. And that's what I find about the Tibetans. They're very authentic. There's no pretending to be holy and they're very authentic, and I find that very important because Buddhas come in all shapes and sizes. Not just one shape. Busy
Yeah,
Buddhas, loud Buddhas, fast Buddhas, slow Buddhas. It's all right. Be who we are. Be authentic. That's really
I love
important.
that.
But like you said before, we can extract the valid parts of our mind, get rid of the unhappy bits, not chuck the whole baby out with the bathwater. It's really
Yeah.
important.
Yeah. So we are nearing the end of our allotted time, and I did have one question I wanted to throw by you.
Yeah.
And this is relating to your work. I mean, the fact that you've taken these teachings to people who are serving life sentences, some of the
Mm,
most, like I said, dire circumstances,
that's
and you've
right.
also taught householders and other monastic people. So I'm curious, have you recognized unexpected similarity between all of these people that you just would not have predicted?
Well, I think we have cliched views of a person who's a child and a person who's a householder, a person who's a homosexual, a person who's a prisoner. We have all these labels. And they are valid labels. You are a prisoner, you are a homosexual, you are a householder, you are a child, but we give them too much power. We're all human beings. It's such a cliche. But I mean, I find that we are totally the same. There's not a fraction of difference. So the teachings I give to people in prison, they can be even more receptive to it because their situations are so dire and they really take the opportunity. But for me, there's no difference. I find the Buddhist model of the mind is absolutely applicable to every human being, every person, there's no doubt. The similarities are clearly far more than the differences. Those labels we use are true labels, but they're very superficial. We give too much power to those labels. You know,
Yeah.
that's the problem. That's politics, isn't it? Male, female, black, white, this, that. We all do it, but it's just they're so superficial labels. They're facts, but they're superficial labels. They're not at the core. So the real one that not even our humanity. I mean, the Buddhist view is what I found very powerful when I first heard the teachings, because if we take the Buddhist view of what the mind is, consciousness, it's in its nature completely pure. So, and that's the one thing that combines it. So your mind is not male or female or dog or non-binary or anything. They're just characteristics that we take on board karmically. But our fundamental nature is our own goodness and clarity and wisdom and positive qualities that we have to learn to uncover and become. That's what combined. That's what we all share. And the dogs and the ants and the monkeys as well. They've all got the same nature.
Mm, wonderful. I feel like that's a great place to end this.
Good.
So, for listeners who are just buzzing with the nature of your delivery, where can they keep plugging into your teachings, and how could they maybe get involved a little bit more with what you have going on?
There's a website, my name, Robina Courtin, and I think on there I do people write to me, so I have a question answer every week, a letter. I do a blog every week, and there are podcasts there, and there's my schedule for my teachings that are on Zoom and in person around the world, and then also I think there's a YouTube channel with teachings on it.
Wonderful.
That's it.
Yeah. I've also really enjoyed your Instagram posts as well. I
Oh,
find
good.
those to
Okay, that's
be,
right. I forgot about those. It's social media business. That's
yeah,
right. Instagram
yeah.
and it's on TikTok, I think, and other things. That's right. Now, 30-minute, my 30-second, my 60-second, 90-second little. So there's an advantage in talking fast, Brett. Get plenty in
Yeah.
one in 1 minute.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about.
Can I sing a
Wonderful.
prayer? I'll sing a little prayer to finish. May I sing a little prayer about
Yes.
bodhicitta, compassion?
Please do.
May compassion, it's like 30 seconds, maybe less. Compassion grow and grow in the hearts of all. Jangchob semcho grinpoche, ma ke panam ke gyuchig, ke panyampa me payang, gong ne gong du palva sho. That's it. Okay.
Thank you so much, Venerable Robina. I
I'm sorry, I have to cough.
appreciate this. It's
Thank
okay.
you, John. So sorry.
Yeah.
Okay,
It's
thank you for
alright.
having me. You're doing a great job. You keep moving, okay? It's wonderful what you're doing.
Thank you.
I admire.
You as well. Yeah.
Thank you, sweetheart.
Bye. All right, everybody, that was the episode. Thank you so much for listening all the way through till the end. Rabina really did make that an easy one for us, I'm sure. If you want to stay in touch with her platform, head on over to rabinacourtin.com. Check out some of her teachings. She does a lot of Zoom stuff, really incredible. Really encourage the social media connection. I'm sure if you resonated with this episode, you're already there. Yeah, that was it. Thank you again so much. We'll see you in 2 weeks with another conversation. Appreciate each and every one of you. I continue making the show for you in particular. All right. Have a good week.